We're good.
All right. Well, shall I just continue?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, folks, thanks for your patience for the technological issues and the interference, which was obviously very intentional from someone who doesn't want us to get the message out tonight. So we'll try again. And for those who try to join by Zoom in good faith, this recording will be made available to you later. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. My email address is at the bottom of this first screen. All right, well, I'm Dr. Chad Hanson. I'm a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project based in the Sierra Nevada. And I'm also the author of the book Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. People want more information, a lot more information. You can certainly get it in my book Smokescreen, which I wrote for non-scientists. I wrote this for a general public audience, so it's accessible to all. All right, so I'm going to do my presentation in two parts tonight before we turn it over to Dr. Moench. The first part is really about whether or not this current approach that's the dominant management paradigm right now at the state and federal level of using taxpayer money, massive levels of taxpayer money, to do what is kind of euphemistically called forest management or thinning or fuel reduction out in the wildlands, which, 19 times out of 20, these are logging projects, whether that is stopping fires and protecting communities, whether that's keeping communities safe from wildfires, is that really effectively curbing fire? All right, so, the first thing I'm going to talk about is this notion that fires are moving faster and more intensely through forests because the forests are too dense, because they're overgrown. We hear this all the time, and I call this the overgrown forest myth. The reality is that this issue has been studied to death by scientists from universities, independent scientists from NGOs like myself, even the Forest Service's own scientists. We've all studied this, and it turns out that denser forests actually burn less intensely on average, not more intensely. And this is a figure from just one of the many, many studies on this issue. This is a figure from Zald and Dunn 2018. And you can see on the x-axis there, that's biomass. And as biomass goes up, in other words, forest density, that the fire intensity goes down overall. And that's that black squiggly line higher up on the graphic there. Is that biomass goes up, fire intensity kind of goes down and then kind of plateaus. And the bottom line is that denser forests do not burn more intensely. There's a bunch of additional research done on this by Les Meester et al. 2019, 2021, Meigs et al. 2020, and I've done research on it too. A related question is, if forests haven't burned in a very, very long time, if you're talking about some of the forests that where fire exclusion has been most complete or most dramatic over the past century, 75, 80 years, or 100 years or more. The general notion, the narrative out there is that those forests will burn a lot more intensely when they burn in wildfires because they're going to be much more dense. Once again, we've looked at this again and again and again, and the vast majority of scientific studies, independent scientists, Forest Service scientists, all of us, the great majority of the studies find that forests that have not burned in the longest period of time tend to burn at equal or lower intensities. Now, I've published 2 studies on this, and I didn't find any difference. They certainly didn't burn more intensely, the forests that were long unburned, but some researchers found they burn at lower intensities, and this is one of those studies. This is Odian et al. 2010, and that bar on the right is TSF is time since fire. So those are forests that have not burned in more than 75 years, and that black strip at the bottom of the bar, that's the percent high severity fire. And you can see that the long unburned forests have a lower level of high severity fire than the forests that have burned more recently. And I know that seems counterintuitive, and I'll explain why it's occurring that way in a moment. But the most important thing to understand is that forest fires are driven mostly by weather and climate factors. And climate change, hot, dry, windy conditions, especially in a drought year. If you have an ignition, you're going to have a larger, more significant fire. And because fires are driven by those weather and climate factors. Forest density is not irrelevant, but it's very secondary. And to the extent that it matters in the opposite direction from what most people assume, and certainly in the opposite direction from what a lot of the agencies and entities and companies that financially benefit from logging in our forests would like us to believe. So what we're finding is that forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most logging, which tend to be the least carbon rich because so many trees have been removed, those forests tend to burn the most intensely. And that often is in a direction toward a town. And this finding comes from Bradley et al. 2016. I'm a co-author of that study. This is the largest scientific analysis ever conducted on this question. We analyzed fires from 3 decades of data, over 1,500 fires spanning more than 23 million acres of fire areas. And this was just the largest assessment ever done on this. And we found that logging is a key secondary factor, and it tends to make fires burn faster and hotter. So the more trees you remove, the faster and hotter fires are going to tend to burn. Very much the opposite of what we're being told, and oftentimes by the media as well. And lots of research backs this up. Logging often increases fire intensity. Yes, thin forests can burn at low intensity, and they often do, just like unthin forests frequently burn at low intensity. But more often than not, those thin forests are going to burn more intensely, which are these bars heading to the right there. That's increased fire intensity. And not only that, but fires tend to burn faster. The rate of spread tends to increase where thinning has occurred. And this is a quote from a study called Stevens et al. 2021. And these folks are very much proponents of thinning. They're promoting thinning, but they had to acknowledge that it makes fires grow bigger faster. So they said, interestingly, surface fire rates of spread increased after what they're calling restoration and fuel treatments, which is commercial thinning, relative to the untreated stand. And they attribute that to the influence of thinning on the microclimate of the forest. And that's a key factor I'm going to come back to in a minute. But I think I'm just going to read this quote from a group of U.S. Forest Service scientists who very courageously published this research after a very large and exhaustive analysis. They found more open forests with lower biomass had higher fire severity because the type of open, lower biomass forests resulting from thinning and other logging activities have hotter, drier, and windier microclimates. And those conditions decrease dramatically over relatively short distances into the interior of older forests with multi-layered canopies and high tree density. In other words, denser forest, higher tree density, more biomass, higher canopy cover, lower fire intensity overall. And I studied this in multiple different fires. In the Creek Fire, a 380,000 acre fire in the southern Sierra Nevada from 2020. I published my findings in 2021. And I found that the forests that had previous logging under the rubric of fuel reduction, whether that's commercial thinning or post-fire logging, where trees, live or dead, were removed based on the argument that that was going to curb fire and reduce future fire intensity, those areas actually burn more intensely overall. And the unmanaged forests tended to burn at slightly lower intensity. And the lowest fire intensity was in areas that had previously burned in a wildfire, had no post-fire logging, and then burned again. And so basically fire modifies fire behavior, and it does that quite effectively for a certain period of time. But logging does not accomplish that goal. All it does is damage habitat, put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, and typically make fires burn hotter and faster toward the vulnerable towns. And these are just some pictures of some of these really, really dense old forests that hadn't burned in many decades, that burned at very, very low intensity in the Creek Fire. You can almost not even tell the fires occurred. They were just creeping surface fires. Now, in part, that's, of course, because the fire weather was relatively moderate in that time period when this stand burned. But in part, it's because it's a very dense old stand that has a very cool, moist microclimate because of the high tree density, because of the high canopy cover. Similar here, this forest was very, very dense. It burned at very low intensity. The fire killed some seedlings and some saplings. You can see some of those in the foreground there, but it burned at very low intensity. Now, what we often saw in the thin forest was quite the opposite. This forest was commercially thinned. You can see the stumps there. and it burned at very high intensity, and like many of the thin forests. Now, of course, many thin forests burned at low intensity too, so it's not like it's homogeneous, but on average, they tended to burn hotter in this fire. This is a very, very open forest. Most of the trees had been removed years earlier by commercial thinning. You can see the stumps there and the stump holes. There was very, very wide spacing between trees. And the Forest Service claimed that would prevent crown fire. It did quite the opposite. These forests burned very, very intensely. And I looked at this question in the antelope fire in Northern California in the antelope fire of 2021. I published my findings last year. And I looked at one key question, which people hadn't asked before, which is, what happens when you actually include the tree mortality from thinning itself with the tree mortality from wildfire? Because, of course, thinning is a major source of tree mortality. And if you're not including that, you're actually biasing your results. You're presenting misleading results in a sense, because you're starting from a place of lower tree density in the first place, because most of the trees have been killed by thinning. What I found is that what I called cumulative severity, and that's mortality from thinning and fire, it was significantly higher in the commercial thinning units, 59% tree mortality overall, relative to the unthinned forest, which was only 39% tree mortality overall. And that difference was statistically significant. We decided to test that theory on another large fire, the Caldor fire of 2021, and see if the results held up. We published those findings last year in Baker and Hanson 2022, and we found the same thing. Cumulative severity was significantly higher in the commercial thinning units than it was in these denser unthinned forests. In other words, thinning is killing significantly more trees than it's preventing from being killed, and it's certainly not curbing wildfires. And there's a very tragic example of this that I want to talk about because it's really important to me. These are places that I know. In the years before the Caldor fire occurred, this is in the northern Sierra Nevada, the Forest Service had done a series of thinning projects, and one in particular called the Trestle Project, south of the community of Grizzly Flats. And they had implemented part of that logging project. It wasn't fully implemented, but they had implemented a lot of the commercial thinning units in the years before the Caldor fire occurred. And what they told the public, what they told the town, was that the, quote, fuel treatments have the effect of the same effect in slowing or stopping a wildfire under 90th percentile conditions. 90th percentile is very extreme high fire weather. And so basically they said that the fire would just stop, would slow or stop in these thinning units. And basically people took that message and they thought, well, I don't need to worry about doing my home hardening, my defensible space pruning around my home, because the fire is going to be stopped out there in the wildlands, deep out there in the wildlands on that ridge in that thinning unit. And they even had a nice graphic in the fuels report for this Trestles project. And you see these kind of yellow curvy lines. That's the course of the fire that they projected. And then it hits these purple and green polygons. Those are the thinning units, and it shows the fire stopping in the thinning units. And so they literally told the community that they didn't need to worry about fire coming there because their thinning project would stop it. And this is what actually happened. This is the fire severity map from the Caldor fire. And those black polygons, those are thinning units, and you can see the red is high severity. The Grizzly Flats community is over on the western side. The fire started south of the community, burned through large areas of thinning very, very intensely. And it burned through the unthinned forest intensely too there because it was really hot, dry, windy conditions. And then it burned down most of the town because the town was not protected. The focus had not been put there, which is what it should have been. The one place where the fire really did stop was where defensible space pruning had occurred right next to homes, within a couple hundred feet of homes or less, on the other side of the fire near South Lake Tahoe in the community of Myers. And you can see those black narrow ovals. That's where defensible space pruning had occurred, and the fire stopped there. Defensible space works. It's not logging, it's just pruning. And it can be maintained every year effectively. That was effective, just like it is in other fires. But logging is not out in the wildlands. And the most dramatic example of this, of course, is the campfire of 2018, which burned through several thousand acres of heavily logged forest on both public and private lands, where live and dead trees had been removed in commercial thinning and post-fire logging operations from earlier fires. And this was all done under the guise of fuel reduction and fire management. The community was told once again that all this logging would stop the fire and save them from fire. People didn't do their defensible space pruning around their homes within 100 feet of homes. They didn't do their home hardening, sweep those pine needles off the roof and the dry leaves, and put on modern ember-proof vents to prevent those flaming embers from being driven by the winds into that old coarse wire mesh attic vent. They didn't do that work because people thought that they could trust these agencies and the logging companies, that all that logging was fuel reduction. Well, those logged areas, those thousands of acres that were so heavily logged, that's what the fire burned through the fastest and the most intensely. And it reached the town of Paradise much, much faster than it otherwise would have. People had very little time to evacuate. 86 people lost their lives and over 14,000 homes were burned. And that's preventable. If we focus our resources, we take all these billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money that's being wasted on counterproductive activities, subsidizing logging out in the remote wildlands. And instead, if we redirect that money into a jobs program to help homeowners do the home hardening and do the defensible space pruning, help those communities become fire safe, as well as evacuation assistance, it's highly effective. It will save many homes. It will save many lives. There was a trio of articles that came out in 2021 that said, well, and by Forest Service scientists and university scientists funded by the Forest Service. And they said, they falsely claimed that the issue is settled scientifically and that no one should question the thinning paradigm anymore. And it's really interesting because that article got a lot of press, and they promoted it as if the scientific issue is settled. And here's the interesting thing: the central article among those three, which is called Pritchard et al. 2021, they acknowledged over and over and over again, because their article had to go through the scientific peer review process, and sometimes that process fails, but other times at least it requires them to make some key concessions. They admitted over and over again that thinning really has all kinds of problems and it's not effective. It often causes higher surface fuel loads. Quote, thinning can contribute to high intensity surface fire and elevated levels of associated tree mortality, elevated fire intensities. Thinning, quote, can lead to increased surface wind speed and fuel heating, which allows for increased rates of fire spread in thin forests. And they admitted this is true even if where thinning and prescribed burning occurs, prescribed fire after thinning. Thinning may increase the risk of fire by increasing sunlight exposure to the forest floor, drying vegetation, promoting understory growth, and increasing wind speeds. A lot of those microclimate effects we talked about earlier. And the Pritchard et al. Study cited a number of studies ostensibly as support for this thinning paradigm. And they said, okay, we cite these other studies and they support what we're saying. Well, we looked at those studies carefully, and they actually the results of those studies actually didn't support that conclusion. They supported, if anything, the opposite conclusion. One of them, Povak et al., showed that the thinning forests had mostly higher intensity fire, moderate and high. They did not burn mostly at low intensity. Pritchard et al. 2020 showed that the reburn of previous wildfires had the lowest fire intensity compared to the thinning categories. So why are we thinning when fire alone has the result that they claim to seek? And then Joachim-Kent et al. 2015 showed that the thin forest had the fewer live trees and less carbon than reburned wildfires with no thinning. So again, wildfire alone works just great, does the job and creates wonderful habitat. We'll talk about that in a minute. My colleagues and I published just several weeks ago a very, very exhaustive, comprehensive analysis, Baker et al. 2023, taking a deep dive look at one of these three Forest Service studies, Hagman et al. 2021, which in many ways was used as the kind of baseline for what historical forest density and fire severity was like. And it turns out that they omitted every single reply study, peer-reviewed study that had been published that had criticized the Forest Service's articles that had responded to our initial articles. And so they created a false narrative that their response articles were the last word, when in fact those response articles had been soundly discredited by a whole series of reply articles over the course of 2 decades that they didn't mention. And we concluded, quote, our rebuttal shows that evidence omitted in the review left a falsification of the scientific record with significant land management implications. Bottom line is the low severity model was rejected. This idea that fires were all frequent low severity historically in the forest were all low density and open and park-like. And in fact, the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence supports the mixed severity model, where you had low, moderate, and high severity fire, and you had forests with a range of densities. You had open forests, but you also had very, very dense forests, and they were actually quite common. I'm going to briefly address, one other key thing, because it comes up a lot, which is this notion that if you have a lot of dead trees in the forest, snags, that somehow that's going to drive higher fire intensity. And that's not true either. The overwhelming body of scientific evidence finds that forests with more dead trees burn at either equal or lower intensities. This study found that they burned at lower intensities. And my own research, I found that there just wasn't a relationship. And that's what most research finds. It's just not a relevant factor, the number of dead trees, which is really interesting. It's counterintuitive, but that's what we're finding consistently. One of the factors is that, dead trees, when they break off parts of them or they fall, they act more like giant sponges than they do like fuel. They can soak up, down logs will soak up 25 times more water per cubic foot than the surrounding soil, even in a drought year. And from a climate change perspective, even the biggest wildfires will only consume less than 2% of the tree biomass. In stark contrast, the average commercial thinning project will remove a very large portion of the biomass. It might be as little as 15 or 20%. That's typically on the low end. It might be over 50%. And of course, most of that goes into the atmosphere because very little, only a small percentage of a given tree that's removed from the forest through logging, only a small percentage ends up in a lumber product. Most of the carbon in the tree, the branches, the treetop, the bark, the round parts, the mill residue, that's burned for energy as a very dirty form of energy, a very climate polluting form of energy in biomass plants. And it's about 40%, produces 40% more CO2 per unit of energy produced relative to coal. So it's even worse than coal from a climate change perspective. And very, very conservatively, one study found that thinning emits at least 3 times more CO2 into the atmosphere per acre than wildfire alone. And that's a very conservative finding. And as I mentioned, most of the carbon in a given tree ends up in the atmosphere almost immediately after logging. This is a really cool figure from Ingerson, 2007, that just illustrates that. All right, so briefly, before I turn it over to Dr. Moench, I'm just going to talk about the ecology of these forests and address this narrative that we hear all the time that high intensity fire destroys forests. And I'm going to just raise the question, is that really true based upon the evidence, what we know now scientifically? Well, the first thing that most people don't realize is that even the biggest fires are mostly low and moderate intensity. This is the 257,000 acre rim fire here. This is the fire severity map. And those red areas are high intensity fire patches. That's 19.9% of the fire. But the green and the yellow are low and moderate, and that's over 80% of the fire. That's pretty common. A lot of fires are only 10 or 15% high intensity across the West. They can be higher. They can be 30 or 40%. That's not typical. But in pretty consistently, these fires are mostly low and moderate intensity. Historically, before fire suppression and logging policies, these fires were in the Sierra Nevada mixed conifer forest, for example, were about 20 to 35% of any given fire. So it's pretty natural to have a healthy mix of low, moderate, and high. In fact, a whole lot of wildlife species have evolved to depend on those high intensity patches, and I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the big sources of confusion is that the U.S. Forest Service published a whole series of scientific studies over about a decade ago. And they claimed that they used these historical forest surveys from the Forest Service's early days, about a century old, century-old surveys. And they said, well, they used these surveys and they presented the results, and the forests were very open and park-like and low density historically, and very little high severity fire. And I asked for their data, and they refused to provide it. Which in science, you really need to share your data. You need to make your data available to other scientists and to the public. It's important. And so I thought that was interesting. It piqued my curiosity. So I went to the National Archives, where they got these original historical records, these century-old surveys. And I spent many, many months researching these historical data sets. And I found that they had omitted most of the data. They had omitted most of the data as a whole, and even the portion of the data they used, they omitted the small tree data and also abundant records of high severity fire. When we included all the data, it turns out that historical forests were 7 times denser than the Forest Service reported in terms of trees per acre. In mixed conifer forests and in ponderosa pine forests, they were 17 times denser. So, this was a big omission. And turns out, forests, there were open forests, yes, they were a minor portion, but most of them were medium or high density. There was fire of all intensities. You had low intensity surface fire, but you also had lots of moderate intensity fire and high intensity fire patches. This is a map from the U.S. Geological Survey in the northern Sierra Nevada, showing large high intensity fire patches that had occurred at some point during the 1800s. Over the course of that century. Those are white polygons with the white cross hatching. Those are large, high intensity fire patches. And some of those are 5, 10, 15, 20,000 acres in size or more. And so, the question is, well, when these high intensity fire patches occur, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that the research is strongly telling us that these high intensity fire patches create snag forest habitat, which is a unique forest habitat type that is comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. These areas are ecological treasures. They attract enormous variety and diversity of native insect species that depend on the fire-killed trees to reproduce, like wood-boring beetles. Many different woodpecker species have evolved to depend on the larvae of those wood-boring beetles. And they also depend on the fire-killed trees because they're softer than live trees, and they can excavate nest cavities in them more easily. And the woodpeckers excavate, multiple nest cavities every year. They pick the one they like the best each year, and the ones they don't use are available to all the other cavity nesting species in the forest. Bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, they all need tree cavities to raise their young, but they can't create their own. They need the woodpeckers to do that. Woodpeckers need the beetle larvae, and the beetles need the fire-killed trees. And so you have this really rich interconnected system. In fact, overall bird abundance is often highest in forests with the highest fire intensities. And, contrary to popular misconception, forests regenerate quite well naturally after high-intensity fire patches. This is me and climate scientist Dr. James Hanson in a high-intensity fire patch in the Rim Fire, and this is typical. This was just about 8 years post-fire, I believe. Trees were already well over the tops of our heads, and this was one of the many areas where the Forest Service said that it burned too intensely and it would not regenerate without their intervention. And this is what their intervention looks like. This is right next door to that previous photo, same high-intensity fire patch, but in this area, they had post-fire logged about 4 or 5 years earlier and then planted trees based on the claim that post-fire logging was necessary to reduce fuels and to facilitate reforestation, because they claimed it wouldn't naturally regenerate on its own. In reality, the logging machinery killed almost all the natural regeneration, and what they planted in these nursery-grown seedlings mostly just died. And same thing here. This is deep in the interior of one of the largest high-intensity fire patches in the Rim Fire. This is at 8 years post-fire. These conifer saplings were already 12 feet tall at that point in time. They're much taller now. Of course, this was all natural regeneration. It's over 1,000 feet away from the nearest live surviving tree, which is very rare, but it happens in certain places, and the forests regenerate just fine if they're left alone. Right next door, same high-intensity fire patch. This was post-fire logged and planted several years earlier, and this is what you get: a stump field, bare ground, and a bunch of invasive combustible grasses that were spread by the logging machinery, and this is called cheatgrass. And one of the big reasons for the confusion is that Forest Service was using in their studies field plots that were really, really small, way too small. And so they were ending up with a lot of zeros. A lot of their field plots had no conifer seedlings in them because the field plots were so small. And of course, if the smaller your plot is, the more zeros you're going to have, the smaller your plot size. And so we corrected that methodologically, and we found that in the areas where the Forest Service claimed there was very little or no regeneration at all, there was 100, 200 or more per acre in those very same areas. You just had to use an appropriate field plot size. And we even had over 100 per acre, even more than 300 meters, more than 1,000 feet into the interior of the largest high-intensity fire patches. And this is all natural regeneration. And just for perspective, those areas in the interior of the large high-intensity fire patches is just a tiny fraction of 1% of the landscape, even within these big fires. It's really interesting. It's a very, very small percentage. It kind of has an outsized place in the public dialogue about these fires. But interestingly, when you look at it from a biodiversity perspective, the research shows that while only a small fraction of 1% of the forests is comprised of these interior areas of large high-intensity fire patches, 13% of the bird species preferentially select these interior areas of large high-intensity fire patches. So that's telling you that they actually have significant ecological importance. So I will stop sharing there and turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Moench. Oh, I think you're muted there.
Anybody have a question?
I'll repeat it if not.
Chad, we're going to entertain one or two questions while I get my computer hooked up.
Sure, no problem.
Okay.
I'm just curious if you stating or you referring to, it seems that you're referring to logging practices in the wildlands. Fitting around this area is often used as what you call defensible space pruning. So my fear is that the terminology mix-up might be confusing for some of the folks in the audience who might think anytime I hear that fitting is going to happen, or I hear chainsaws around the neighborhood, that's logging, which doesn't seem like that's kind of the point we were trying to make. Is that right?
Yeah, I couldn't fully hear the question, but it sounded like, and please, Johnny or Dr. Moench, if you could repeat it if I get it wrong, but it sounded like the question was about terminology, and thinning isn't always logging, which is true. And so we want to be clear that if it's defensible space pruning, for example, within 100 feet of a home, and someone happens to call it thinning, that's actually something that's going to help the homeowner. It's not logging that's going to make things worse. If that's the question, then I completely agree. That's true. And it's just important to note that, well, there are exceptions where people say, call it thinning, and it really is seedlings and saplings and lower limbs next to a home. The great majority of the time when people say thinning, it really is a commercial logging project out in the deeper wildlands.
And is there any commercial logging projects that are slated for this area?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Was there any commercial logging projects slated for this area? For Utah?
Oh, yes, yeah. There are, unfortunately, there are. And by the way, it's not always just thinning. Sometimes it's straight up clear cutting. So, folks should know, and, I'm sure many of you already know this, but, not everyone knows this. The main land management activity that the Forest Service engages in is selling public trees to private logging companies and keeping the revenue for its budget. And it subsidizes this with taxpayer money. And so the U.S. Forest Service is quite literally in the commercial logging business. They do a lot of things. Not everything they do is commercial logging, and not everything they do is bad or ill-advised. There are a lot of good people in the Forest Service, but the agency is sort of financially incentivized to behave badly and prioritize logging. And you can find out about the sorts of things they're doing if you go on the website of any given national forest in your area and click on land and resource management, and then click on, you'll see a drop-down menu and click on projects. And you'll see all the different projects that they're listing. They'll typically, call them things like the such and such forest health project or the such and such thinning and fuel reduction project. But as I mentioned in my book, and discuss in detail, these are euphemisms for commercial logging in the great majority of cases. Not every case. You can find exceptions, but they're fairly rare.
All right, thanks, Chad. If you can still hang on with us for other questions, maybe at the end.
Sure.
Let's talk about some of the other aspects of this forest management strategy that I think are a real public concern. First off, let me begin with our motto, ask your doctor if clean air is right for you, which is, of course, a dig at the big pharma ads that were plastered all over the TV all the time. And if your doctor doesn't know the answer to that question, you need a new doctor. This is an Iraq military burn pit. What's being emitted here is particulate matter, carbon monoxide, PAHs, heavy metals, VOCs like benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, dioxins, PCBs, phthalates, formaldehyde, polyvinyl chloride. Some of the most toxic substances that we know of. Now, it's very telling that the U.S. Defense Department has finally acknowledged that, in fact, yes, this really did harm people. And so now they are being granted disability awards for their exposure. This is a Utah burn pit. Maybe it's not fair to call it a pit, but this is a similar sort of experience here. Has deadly particulate matter, carbon monoxide, PAHs, heavy metals, dioxins, VOCs, formaldehyde, and acrolein. Not exactly the same kind of chemical mix-up as the Iraq burn pits, but very similar. And the overall health hazard is also very similar. We all acknowledge now, I think almost everybody acknowledges, that those Iraq burn pits were really a mistake and a serious assault on public health. We don't think about that at all with what we're doing here in this kind of a situation. And we're using these kinds of terms that are fairly crafted nomenclature. Overstory, treatment, restoration, risk reduction, rehabilitation, habitat enhancement, vegetation management, hazardous fuel unloading, prescribed burns, and good fire. All very comforting terms to make you think differently about what's going on. I want you to look at one of these Colorado burn pits. Again, it's not really a pit. Tell me if you think any of those comforting terms apply to this. This is quote forest treatment, supposedly.
So you said this was the Mirror Lake Highway?
No, this is in Colorado.
Well, they did it Mirror Lake Highway.
Well, it could be. Well, the point of this is a policy that is being replicated throughout the West. Now, if those of you who care about air pollution, obviously that's pretty much my focus in life. You look at that and you're just shocked. How can we be doing that sort of thing and think that that's good for anybody? Well, this is Elon Musk's explosion of his rocket a couple of weeks ago, and he must have talked to the Forest Service to decide how to spin this to the public. So we called it a rapid unscheduled disassembly. This, of course, is the sinking of the Titanic. And if the Forest Service was consulted in their PR, they would have called this underwater habitat enhancement. And this, of course, is the explosion of the Hindenburg. And if the Forest Service PR folks were in charge of spinning this, they would have called this
thinning the skies of dirigibles. They want to call these kinds of things prescribed burns. No doctor would prescribe this to anybody or anything. We would use terms like this: air pollution nightmare, egregious public health menace, environmental destruction, assault on the climate, dissemination of poison, because that's exactly what it is. Now, Johnny, are you going to be able to hear anything from this video? This is video recorded in the state of Utah. Probably not. So, under the auspices of making the forest healthy, they are creating this mess here. And you will say, if I had the audio here, this person who's coming on the screen right now from the U.S. Forest Service is going to tell you that, well, you're just going to have to put up with it because this is a good thing. He said, quote, "We all need to learn to accept this." Well, let me tell you, your lungs are not going to learn to accept that. Your heart is not going to learn to accept it. Your blood vessels won't. If you're a 3-month fetus in your mother's womb, you will not be learning to accept that. What will happen is just a weekend of this kind of pollution will have lifelong impacts on the organ development of that child. And now we know, in fact, that will affect their genetic integrity such that the children of those children will also have their health affected by this kind of short-term exposure to air pollution. Now, why is wood smoke so toxic? Well, first, it involves extremely small particles. The smaller the particle of air pollution, the more toxic it is, because the more easily it's inhaled, the more difficult it is to exhale. And then once picked up by the bloodstream, the more easily it's delivered throughout the body, penetrating any and all critical organs, including any cell in any organ, including the nucleus of the cell. If a particle is about 30 nanometers in size or smaller, it can be picked up by the bloodstream and delivered in that sort of a fashion. The kinds of autopsy studies now we have about where air pollution ends up in the human body are just chilling. The average person now has between 2 billion and 22 billion nanoparticles of air pollution embedded in their heart muscle per gram of heart tissue. The average brain has millions of pollution particles embedded in brain tissue. And we know this even in infants. The average mother who's pregnant has hundreds of thousands of these nanoparticles of pollution per cubic millimeter in her placenta. That absolutely has to be affecting people's health. And we know from widespread epidemiologic studies, there are now about 60,000 studies of air pollution's effect on health that confirm what a disaster this is. So the size of the particle is very critical, and wood smoke particles are probably the smallest particles emitted from any sort of pollution source that we're commonly exposed to. The second reason why wood smoke is so toxic is because it is saturated with a murderer's row of toxins like VOCs, PAHs, dioxins, heavy metals, mercury, arsenic, probably even some radioactive isotopes. I don't know if you remember, about 3 or 4 years ago, Moscow had some widespread fires, and people were very concerned throughout the world that this was launching some of the radioactivity that is still left over from the Chernobyl accident. Toxicity is not reflected by nearby monitors. The typical EPA PM 2.5 monitor does not pick up much of these ultrafines. You can load those filters with a few PM 2.5 particles, but millions of these ultrafine particles. The toxicity is vastly different, but they will come out the same in a typical air pollution monitor reading. So every critical organ that you have, unfortunately, and this is trying to spin this so it isn't quite so disturbing, but every critical organ you have has been infiltrated by air pollution particles. Some of them may eventually dissolve or be carried out of the system through the lymph nodes and things like that. But then they'll get replaced with other air pollution particles. So nobody escapes this sort of exposure. Nobody should think for 1 second that there is a safe level of exposure. And the fire that you are exposed to from wildfires or prescribed burns or from burning of slash piles, it all has public health toxicity. This is just one of many studies that show wildfire smoke is more toxic to humans than pollution from cars. This particular study showed that it was about 10 times more toxic. And another reason why this is important is because this is a graph of pollution concentration on the x-axis going that way and health outcomes on the y-axis going up. And what you can see here, as soon as we get any air pollution at all, we are having, in this case, what's plotted here is sudden death. So as soon as you get any air pollution at all, we already have sudden death from it. And then the curve at low doses is the steepest part here, and then it flattens out. Now that's mimicked by other sources of pollution like cigarette smoke and secondhand cigarette smoke. They all follow generally this same curve. And what that does is it tells us there's no safe level of air pollution. And if you're going to add an X amount of air pollution to a background level of pollution in the airshed, you're actually doing more harm when you're at this low background level than over here when you have a high background level. That is that parallel studies that show this. Smoking 1 cigarette a day is almost half as much risk as smoking an entire pack, because it follows that same sort of superlinear curve. So more with regard to the public health consequences, the EPA has said almost as much PM 2.5 is emitted from prescribed burns via the Forest Service and other agencies as from wildfires. There really is no evidence that prescribed burns reduce the amount of biomass smoke the public is subjected to. And here's one thing that's not taken into account by anybody that's involved in any sort of government regulations. Lower temperature burns, typically what prescribed burns are supposed to achieve, actually produce more dioxins than high intensity burns. And dioxins are probably the most toxic substance that we know of after plutonium. So from the standpoint of chemical toxicity, prescribed burns can actually be more toxic than high intensity wildfire smoke. Now here's another thing, air pollution actually is sequestered by trees. These little stomata here can sequester some of the toxic gases like carbon monoxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. And then the leaves and the plant absorbs those toxic gases and neutralizes them. With regard to particulate pollution, the particulate pollution can land on these leaves and stay there until the next rainstorm, and then it's washed down to the soil. So trees in an urban setting, trees in a forest setting provide the same sort of protection to a certain degree from air pollution. What you're seeing here is kind of the end stage of one of these slash pile burns. Well, what this is essentially a mini Superfund site, saturated with a witch's brew of all the same kind of stuff. PAHs, that's the acronym for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, dioxins, heavy metals, hydroxide ions that leave a very alkaline pH. This is essentially now a waste zone here. And when the Forest Service and other agencies are doing this by the tens of thousands, what they're creating and doing nothing with is a mini collection of thousands upon thousands of Superfund sites scattered throughout our environment. Prescribed burns are supposed to occur under specified conditions, usually in the late fall, early winter, or in the mid-spring. They're supposed to occur during light winds, low temperatures, moderate humidity with humidity with a supposed clearing index of 500 or better. Now, a couple of years ago, the fire agencies went to the DEQ and said, well, because of this narrow window and these very strict conditions about which we can burn, we've got now this real backlog of all these slash piles that we need to burn. So could you kind of relax the restrictions a little bit? So the DEQ decided to study whether or not that would be a good idea. And this is what they found. This is in an area where they had 1,000 of those slash piles. They light one up, 230 piles they light up, and the PM 2.5 jumps immediately up to here. They light 235 piles and it jumps up to here. This is Beijing, China levels of air pollution. They light 400 piles and it jumps up to here, which is Beijing level air pollution on steroids. And it lasted for 8 hours. Now, if you were a pregnant mother and you were exposed to just this weekend of pollution, you can rest assured that the viability of your baby and the organ development that they depend on for a healthy life is in jeopardy from this kind of exposure. There's absolutely no question about it. And then there are no boundaries to this pollution and therefore no boundaries to the health consequences. People think, oh, well, it's just a localized issue. Well, not true. Western wildfires can affect people thousands of miles away. Now you might think, well, okay, sure, you're talking about bigger fires, hotter fires, gets higher up in the atmosphere and gets carried further. True to a certain extent, but that's not the end of the story. Look at this quote, prescribed burn, and tell me if you think that smoke's going to get into the upper atmosphere. Here are a couple of quotes from people who do this sort of thing for a living. But try and move this away from my screen so I can see it. One thing we see very often is that pollution starts off in one place, but ends up somewhere completely different. Pollution emitted from one source region can find its way around the globe more than once. You don't necessarily get away from air pollution by being further from the sources. These are people who are experts in the distribution of air pollution. Now, a lot of our public news agencies have bought into this narrative that we need to thin the forest to protect the West from wildfires. NPR has bought into it. Reuters has bought into it. Our local news sources, KPCW, just bought into this project that you may have had the misfortune of stumbling across that's going on right now in Parley's Canyon, with a bullhog masticator mulching Parley's Canyon to, quote, prevent wildfires and restore watershed. There is no watershed restoration here. The theory is that this will help prevent a widespread catastrophic fire. And if that were to happen, all of the burned debris would then become a source of debris running into the watershed next time there's a snowstorm or a rainstorm. Well, what they're not taking into account is the treatment to, quote, prevent that is even worse. From KSL.com just a couple of days ago, important wildfire risk reduction efforts continue at Parley's Canyon, and a picture of the end result here over on the side. This is what was going on in Deer Valley in October. More of the same kind of stuff. Now, not all fires the same. This is me trying to cook dinner at home. Needless to say, my wife has not asked me to cook since. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the climate. Dr. Hanson talked about climate-related issues. I'd like to add a few thoughts about that particular angle here, because it's obviously critical. There is no aspect of public policy relevant to climate where either public health or its effect on the climate crisis should take a secondary role to any other consideration. It shouldn't be secondary to wildlife preservation of any kind. It shouldn't be secondary to any sort of forest ecology health. Climate considerations need to start taking priority. We're in a race against time to avoid irreversible climate catastrophe. And the carbon equation of the next decade is about the only thing that matters. Here's just a list of story after story after story. These are a couple years old. The Earth has 11 years to cut emissions to avoid catastrophic climate scenarios, one after another. Various aspects of what the climate crisis will do. We're going to make basically the climate inhospitable for billions of people. The ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica are melting faster than previously thought. It goes on and on and on. And now we're talking about, because of the rapid melting in Antarctica, we're going to affect the ocean current in the Atlantic, which will affect the climate in both Europe and America, and actually slow down what's called the conveyor belt between Antarctica and Greenland. And that is what experts call basically climate catastrophe if that happens. And we're already seeing it. This was just a couple of days ago. The world's wheat supply is at a dangerous level. We expect a shock due to heat and drought. And this was just yesterday. The Panama Canal now is being jeopardized because of drought conditions in Central America. Medical journals throughout the world have started to call the climate crisis the greatest threat to global health. They say that deforestation is as urgent as reducing our emissions of fossil fuels. So on the one hand, we're talking about a policy here that is widespread and embraced seemingly by the media, by government agencies, that we know is contributing to the climate crisis, and we sit here and accept it. Now, we look at something like this. This is the burning of the Amazon rainforest. And anyone who pays any attention to the issue knows that this is disaster. The Amazon has the greatest collection of tropical forests of any place on Earth. And this is absolutely critical to preserve the Amazon in order to avoid climate catastrophe. People in the United States know that. Just about everybody who has any appreciation for or understanding of science knows that what we're talking about here in the Amazon is absolute climate disaster. The forests really are the lungs of the earth. But thinning the forest to restore forest health is no more appropriate than thinning your lungs to improve your breathing. But we're doing that. We're doing that here. We accept it because of this tortured rationale that we've all been sold. By the way, if the forests are the lungs of the earth, then Florida is the ruptured appendix.
Yeah.
And the way I can say that is I have a son in Florida and he's moving to New York because of Florida being the way it is. Okay, why is this related to the climate crisis? Because CO2 absorption, once you cut down a tree, CO2 absorption ends obviously immediately. It ends the long-term carbon sink capability of the forest. Number two is CO2 is immediately released into the atmosphere when these trees are burned. Black carbon that is released is responsible for an absorption of solar energy that is the second largest contributor to the climate crisis after CO2. Thinning can release as much carbon as a wildfire roaring through the same area. Older and less disturbed forests, as Dr. Hanson mentioned, are the best carbon sinks that we have. Forests that are essentially undisturbed store up to 70 times the amount of carbon as logged and replanted forests. Forest trees in the rural setting provide the same benefit that they do in the urban setting. They transfer heat from land surfaces to the atmosphere, reduce Earth's temperature about 0.5 degrees, and per BTU produced wood combustion releases even more CO2 than coal does. If you cut down a 20-year-old tree, you can say, oh yeah, we'll plant another tree to replace it. And then you'll have a tree of the same size in 20 years. But if you let that same tree continue growing for another 20 years, you have much more carbon absorption. So the idea we can cut down our forests and they'll regrow and we'll be back to where we were before, no, it's not working like that at all. Other ecosystem consequences: burning trees scatters black carbon on snowpack throughout the West. accelerating snow melt, and aggravating water loss. In fact, some studies have suggested that some of those spots where the snow is really dirty can be 10 times hotter, 10 degrees hotter than the snow that is pristine in color. Other ecosystem consequences: trees release water vapor and biogenic VOCs that help precipitate cloud formation and more precipitation. They are a critical component of regional water cycles. Logging and thinning causes long-term damage to these carbon sinks, long-term damage to wildlife habitat, natural flood control, and water purification. And that's especially important when we have precipitation extremes like we had this year, like we're going to have more of in the future with the climate crisis. Now, not all fires are the same. This is a dumpster fire, exactly what Elon Musk turned Twitter into when he took it over. Now, Utah's watershed restoration initiative is one of the most problematic parts of this sort of overall strategy. It's being justified by the agencies involved as necessary for watershed health and biological diversity. It improves water quality and water yield and provides, quote, opportunities for sustainable use of natural resources. Well, let's check out some of those claims. This is what's just happened in Parley's Canyon over the weekend. They have just ripped up acre after acre of the scrub oak. They have this on their website. This is a before picture, and I don't know where this is. It's somewhere in central Utah. Now they're going to brag about this particular end result here. This is what happened before they got involved in, quote, forest treatment. That is an utter decimation of that pinyon juniper forest, and it was all intentional.
Is that the cheating?
Pardon? We'll get to that in a second. This is a comment from a gentleman who used to be one of the managers of the Forest Service, Jim Furnish. He was talking a little bit more about specifically what was going on in South Dakota, but this was his observation. It's a shock to the eyes. That's the only way to put it. In my 35-year career with the U.S. Forest Service, including 3 years as deputy chief, I've been to almost all our 125 national forests and have rarely seen anything so unnecessary and damaging and so heartbreaking. This used to be a forest. There's another video clip on the website of Utah's watershed treatment initiative. That's the end result. Now, how are they accomplishing this? This is what's going on in Parley's right now. They're using this bullhog, what do you call it? Bullhog masticator, and they're just pulverizing these trees. Now, what they're not telling you also is the birds nesting in those trees are also obliterated. Their eggs are destroyed. All the other small wildlife is being destroyed. Now, when you talk to some of these people and ask them, why are you doing this in the name of wildlife habitat? They're really thinking about big mammals. They're talking about deer and elk as if that's really where our priorities should lie. But this is what they're doing, quote, in the name of forest health. Now, if any of you have time, I'd like you to write this down and read this article. This is an article on the terrible history of destruction of the pinyon juniper forests in the West. And here's a couple of quotes. Utah public lands have suffered enormous deforestation impacts through the state's watershed restoration initiative and countless BLM projects. After the BLM smashes sagebrush and grinds pine nut forests into wood chips, the agency can turn right around and intensify livestock use in a targeted grazing treatment by claiming cows will now reduce the flammable weeds generated in the first place by the project. Instead of taking better care of the existing sagebrush habitat and protecting them from grazing, development, and flammable cheatgrass expansion, or admitting that the forested areas are the least likely to burn, BLM plans focused on radical deforestation. They never considered that forests of younger trees are in the process of recovering from the previous waves of deforestation. We had 2 previous waves of deforestation in the juniper pinyon pine area of Utah, which is the biggest in the West, by the way. The first was in the mining era in the 1880s, say to 1900. And then it was duplicated again right after World War II, largely sponsored by the federal government. So now we're at a 3rd stage of wiping out these forests. And these forests grew up in their natural area. So these aren't overgrown forests. This is what nature did. So now we're going to tear up the Great Basin with a mind-boggling 10,000 linear miles of fuel breaks, devoid of trees or sage, but full of grassy forage plants. Again, cattle. We're going to prioritize cattle. 7 million forested acres were targeted for destruction across the sage-grouse's range, equivalent to all the pinyon juniper expansion in Nevada, an area larger than the state of Vermont. Now, Chad showed you one of these pictures, and I just wanted to add this thought. You have been told that the forests are so unhealthy because they've been allowed to grow from fire suppression. This is a fire that did this. This is what Mother Nature did with lodgepole pines after the fire. It couldn't be more dense. So are we saying that Mother Nature doesn't know what she's doing? Of course, that's absurd. Now, the other thing is, if you conduct prescribed burns under the premise that we have to get rid of all this vegetation that serves as a, quote, ladder fuel that then ignites the trees, watch this time-lapse photography of how fast. This is a Georgia forest, so it's not quite the same climate as Utah, of course. But watch how fast the understory grows back. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, here's the understory. Here's the prescribed fire. This is 2 months of elapsed time. The understory that they supposedly say is the ladder fuel to the rest of the forest is now back to where it was before 2 months later. So are we going to go through this routine every single 2 months in Georgia or every year in Utah? Absolutely, totally impractical. Okay, the last topic that I want to raise is, in addition to everything else that we think is wrong about this policy, is also involving the use of pesticides to, quote, stage manage growth in the forest. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, I think is the only book my father ever gave me. He gave it to me when I was in junior high, and I read it, and I was just terrified. It's considered probably the most important scientific book after Darwin's The Origin of Species, and is probably more than anything else responsible for the whole movement of environmental activism that eventually ended up precipitating things like the establishment of the EPA. Rachel Carson would be absolutely shocked and disgusted about what we're doing now. We are now exposed to basically a situation of death by 1,000 cuts. The Forest Service isn't the greatest offender in terms of your exposure to various and sundry toxic chemicals, but it's ubiquitous. The Forest Service, UDOT, Department of Transportation, the Department of Natural Resources, the Mosquito Abatement District, the BLM, they're all spraying some version of pesticides, toxic chemicals that are biologic poisons, and nobody's keeping track of the sum total of all the exposure. Everybody's just putting their blinders on and saying, well, I want to do this. Pesticides will help me do it, so that's what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to look at any of the other consequences. One of the things that we've learned in the last 20 years is that a lot of these toxic substances are what we call endocrine disruptors, meaning they mimic or antagonize human hormones that are the most powerful biologic compounds that we know of. They can be terribly hazardous to your health at extremely low doses. A group of experts who study this more than anybody else in the world said whether low doses of endocrine disrupting chemicals influence certain human disorders is no longer conjecture, because epidemiologic studies show that environmental exposures to these chemicals are associated with human diseases and disability. For every chemical that we looked at, we could find a low dose cutoff. If it had been studied at low doses, it had an effect at low doses. We know that this is a universal truth of all these kinds of chemicals. Children are more vulnerable to it than adults. Fetuses are more vulnerable than children. And some of the experts here in the United States have described it this way: these delicate developmental processes are easily disrupted by very small doses of toxic chemicals that would be virtually harmless for an adult. Linda Burnham, director of the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, says existing U.S. regulations have not kept pace with scientific advancements, showing that widely used chemicals cause serious health problems at levels previously assumed to be safe. Well, involved in, say, the planning of a project like the Parley's Canyon Watershed Initiative that's going on right now is supposedly the use of any of these herbicides. So I just want to talk specifically about a few of them. Now, these government agencies have at their disposal dozens of these herbicides, but these are the ones they use the most. So let me just talk about a few of them. In recent years, numerous medical experts and entire medical societies have made strong position statements regarding the danger to humans of even small doses of these kinds of chemicals, and they're linked to obesity, cancer, heart disease, birth defects, reproductive pathology, neurologic and brain disorders such as Parkinson's, impaired intellect, autism, and attention deficit disorder. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the World Health Organization, and the Endocrine Society have all made statements trying to warn the public about this very thing. Specifically about, let me go back to glyphosate, and you know that by the more common name Roundup. Roundup is what has been used more than anything else in these circumstances. Roundup is so ubiquitous in our environment, it is present in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the rain that falls from the sky. The safety of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, and hundreds of other commercial herbicide preparations has been taken for granted by the chemical industry and regulatory agencies. But the bulk of the research supporting this contention has been based on outdated, even unpublished studies commissioned by the manufacturers to defend their application with regulatory agencies. Development of the last 15 years have painted a much more worrisome picture of this herbicide, still the most commonly used pesticide in the world. The medical research is very strong that all real-life environmental exposures of this chemical category are hazardous to human health, including as carcinogens, reproductive toxins, and neurotoxins. Federal legislation passed in 1996 required the EPA to test all pesticides for endocrine disrupting activity. 27 years later, it hasn't happened. Still hasn't happened. The Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention recommended in 2015 that 17 of the highest volume pesticides be tested for endocrine disruption, and that hasn't happened either. So the federal government, the agency in charge of determining whether or not you're exposed to these toxins, hasn't done anything about it for 27 years. 2,4-D. The Chicago Tribune did an extensive expose in 2015 how the EPA tossed aside long-standing safety data and approved dramatic increases in quote, acceptable levels of exposure to 2,4-D. The EPA approved a level 41 times greater than the previous limit, greater than levels considered safe in Russia, Australia, South Korea, Canada, Brazil, and even China, hardly the paragon of environmental protection. To justify that conclusion, the agency's scientists changed their analysis of one pivotal study by Dow Chemical, whose own scientists reinterpreted in midstream data in this study in rats, tossing aside all the consequences of kidney trouble exacerbation, that the Dow's own researchers said were initially caused by 2,4-D. In other words, the judge in the case, citing the National Academy of Sciences, said the EPA's approval of 2,4-D is indefensible, but it's still going to be used throughout this state. Dicamba. One of the reasons for dicumba's destructive potential is that dicumba formulations are notoriously drift prone. It can remain in the air for days. It can be sprayed after it's sprayed and drift for miles. The damage it causes has been found to reach up to 20 miles from the nearest treated field. It has injured 50 million acres of soybeans, decimated fruit orchards, vegetable farms, damaged trees and backyard gardens throughout much of rural America. That's another one that they want to use in Parley's Canyon and the Wasatch Mountains. The Forest Service and the timber industry are notorious for spreading herbicides after a forest harvest so that supposedly they can get the jump on other competing vegetation. So they use 2,4-D and another one that's fallen into disfavor because it's even more toxic, called atrazine. And because the public in this area near the forest started complaining about all kinds of symptoms, the EPA jumped in and decided that they'd test everybody. They tested everybody and found that every single person they tested in the area was excreting 2,4-D and atrazine in their urine. Every single person. And now to make things even worse, we know that 70% of the pesticides released onto the marketplace since 2015 are contaminated with PFAS compounds, which are now considered the most toxic compounds in the 21st century. And we're not really doing anything about it. When I ask agencies and individuals involved in spraying various and sundry insecticides or herbicides, they say they're not testing it. Now, I've just got to notice that the EPA said we have tested a group of insecticides and you can take a little bit of a breather that we didn't find any PFAS compounds in this group that we tested. Well, that's great, except the group they tested was about 24 chemicals. And there are about 16,000 of these kinds of chemicals. So by the time they get through testing the rest of the 16,000, it'll be the 24th century. And we all will have been dead for probably 400 years. So that brings me to this question, and I want Dr. Hanson to chip in here. If this is also counterproductive, if it's also wrong, why does it happen? And while we were trying to get our technological problems worked out, I started to address that a little bit. But in my opinion, it's still happening because we have created institutions around a very seriously mistaken public policy. Once you create an institution around those policies, it is really difficult, if not impossible, to dismantle it. Because you have employees now by the thousands who are engaged in this kind of activity. You have jobs at stake. You have economies that have been now built upon this kind of public policy. And to tell people now, hey, this was really a bad idea. It's really hard. Do you know how long it took us to even minimally curtail what the tobacco industry was doing after we knew that it was killing millions of people? Probably 50 years. In fact, the German Nazis actually had a substantial amount of research in the 1930s and 40s, telling the world how toxic tobacco was to human health, and we didn't do anything about it until just barely in the 1970s. So we have institutionalized a very misguided public policy, and that's one of the main reasons. The Forest Service, since its inception, has been more of an extraction facilitating agency rather than a preservation agency. And the BLM is basically, in many cases, a handmaiden to the cattle industry. So political pressure is involved. Institutionalization of this mistake is involved. Dr. Hanson, what else can you throw in there as to why this is still happening?
Well, I think that, there's certainly a cultural aspect within these agencies, people getting.
Dr. Hanson has a lot of experience being attacked by people in these government agencies for bringing this to light. We were hacked tonight by people who don't want you to hear this. That's why they did it.
Yeah, absolutely true. There's certainly a cultural aspect, in these agencies, young people coming in, get indoctrinated, and they become sort of true believers. But at its core, it's really about the money. If you think about it from the Forest Service's perspective, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, this logging project, they won't call it logging, of course, they'll call it forest health or fuel reduction or thinning. But they'll say, oh, well, we're spending more money on this than we're making from the timber sale receipts, so therefore it's not about the money. Well, that's not true at all. They're getting money from congressional appropriations out of taxpayers' pockets to subsidize it, and then they're getting more money to augment their budget from the timber sale receipts. So they're actually getting money flowing to the agency from two different directions. The fact that expenses are higher than revenues is irrelevant because that balance sheet falls on the shoulders of taxpayers, not on the shoulder of the agency. So this is really fundamentally about money. And the Forest Service is certainly culpable here, but it's also really important to note that it's our policymakers at federal and state levels that are allocating these funds, that are passing laws that promote these policies, and they need to be held accountable, Democrats and Republicans, both of them, because they're both getting a lot of campaign contributions from the logging industry and from other industries involved in these sorts of activities.
Now, I'm not saying we know how to solve this, but we're not going to solve it unless we can get the public engaged. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to write down some of these emails. Joel Ferry is the director of the Division of Natural Resources. He has supervisory authority over a lot of this policy with regard to forests, certainly a lot of supervisory control and responsibility for the use of pesticides for various state agencies. Certainly Governor Cox does. I make it a point to call Governor Cox about every 3 months, just give him a piece of my mind. Now, it's of course to a machine, but I will tell you a little story here about the value of that sort of thing. Some of you may recall that about 7 or 8 years ago, one of the big environmental fights in the state was to try and prevent the Southern Nevada Water Authority from draining the aquifers of central Nevada and shipping that water to Las Vegas. And the worry was that that would dry up the phreatophytes, which are these native plants that send roots 60 feet down into the aquifers and survive drought by those 60-foot long roots. And if they drain those aquifers, all that vegetation would die. The Great Basin would become the Sahara Desert, and all that dust would blow over to the Wasatch Front. Well, Governor Herbert and his, at the time, director of the Division of Natural Resources, went around the state for 2 years telling everybody they're going to sign, they're going to sign, they're going to sign. Finally, our group and a couple other groups mounted a phone banking campaign, and we called Governor Cox's office solid for 2 weeks. The next week, he said, I'm not going to sign. And he hasn't signed, and hopefully that project is dead. Now, I don't know for sure. I've never interviewed Governor Herbert, except I did put him to sleep once. He survived. He was glad. had mixed feelings. No, I'm kidding. But citizen involvement is key and it can really make a difference. So I want you to write down that phone number and consider calling Governor Cox and leaving him a message. Send him some written comments here. Send similar comments to Joel Ferry. I want you to write down these numbers. These are the people who are lower down in the total poll in the Division of Natural Resources and who are responsible for these policies at the field level. We've talked to them. Johnny and I have talked to them. I wouldn't say we convinced them. I wasn't a bit surprised we didn't convince them with that one meeting, but we're going to keep at it. And if the public starts to weigh in, if we get 50 people sending these people messages about what are you doing? Why are you doing this to our forests? Why are you spreading pesticides in all of these areas that you're denuding? Why are you lighting bonfires as some sort of cure for forest health? Why are you not taking into account the climate crisis consequences of what you're doing? Write those down and start sending them some messages. And then to learn more about both of these issues, I encourage you to go to our website and to the John Muir Project website and educate yourself and then educate your family and your friends. And let's see if we can't spread the word. Thank you. Questions? Are you also absolutely recoiled and depressed and